Alright, I have this whole intro laid out here, but I'm not gonna waste your time. The reason that your melodies probably aren't that great, or that you can't often make a lot of good ones, is probably because you aren't using repetition enough. I know that's not some crazy answer or some like revolutionary discovery like fire or something, but oftentimes it is the simplest reasons of why we screw up. And I was here too. I used to make melodies that hardly made any sense and just kept droning on, and then even I, as the composer, would get bored of it. Are you having that same problem too? If so, keep watching. Listen to this melody right here and tell me if you think it's good or not. Of course it sounds good. Do you hear those first two bars though? Exact repetition, so let me tell you how this works because it's not quite as simple as it seems. The reason that example before worked so well was because it wasn't afraid to use one-to-one repetition. You repeat any specific bar motive exactly, especially when they're right beside each other. There's a good chance that you usually don't choose to do that. And that is perhaps a problem because one-to-one repetition, simply cloning a singular idea as it is a great way to build melodies. So that's your first tip here. Just repeat a bar or two one-to-one and see how well it works, because it'll probably still sound pretty good, if not make things more coherent and better. But oftentimes, on a motive level, you can't just repeat things one-to-one, and I understand that. In that case, you need to repeat it, but change one thing about it. Either a few pitches, a few rhythm lengths, but try to keep the overall contour the same, because then it still sounds like the same motive and is still recognizable to the listener. So now let's talk about repeating melodies on a phrase level, because this is how you build longer and more complex melodies, which involves basically copy and pasting an entire phrase, which could be 4 bars or maybe 8 bars, and then changing something about the second phrase, which could be the beginning or at the end, but usually it happens at the end, more towards the climax of the melody, which the climax happens at around the 75% mark, and that's usually when things get to its highest point or its lowest point. And that's the best part to actually change, because you have that very comfortable, familiar sounding beginning, and then that ending, you are able to spice things up a bit more. But don't change things too much, of course, because this video is still about repetition. So try to stay faithful to the original phrase as much as possible without having it sound too boring, too samey. And of course, harmonic context is extremely important here, because usually the first phrase ends on a half cadence, say, which means on like the 5 chord, and then the second phrase ends on the tonic, or maybe that is a reverse, but generally it is usually the first phrase ends on the 5 chord, and then the next one is on the tonic. And overall, this change in harmonic context will make a huge difference to the actual melody itself. Therefore, to keep things harmonically interesting, you must change the melody while still keeping some of the familiar elements. Now here is a bonus tip, which doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with a repetition itself, but it does help with making melodies a lot, and that involves melodic form, of which there are 2 main types. There is sentence form and then period form. So sentence form, what is that about? Basically, sentence form is a smaller scale form, usually 4 to 8 bars, usually only one phrase. because it's all connected by the basic idea, which immediately starts things out. So first step is basic idea. Second step is basic idea repeated, which is oftentimes a very close, if not one-to-one repetition. And then after that, you do something called fragmentation, which involves taking that basic idea and its individual components and putting them on their own. And then after that, you end things off on a cadence, half or full, and usually that is the most simple part of the entire melody, because it's usually just like a scale run down or a run up, or it's just some very simple, predictable figure. That was a long explanation. Anyways, so period form involves two phrases, and it's super simple. The first phrase ends on a half cadence, and then the second phrase is almost identical to the first phrase, except it ends on a full cadence. And usually the last 1 or 2 bars will be slightly different. And I recommend putting these forms together. So usually this would be 2 sentence forms within a period form. The moral of the story is that don't be a nerd who is afraid to use repetition, because it's actually a good thing and it doesn't make your music boring. And in fact, having the ability to take one idea and then turn it into a different idea that has been developed upon is a very important skill. And for that, you should click on this video about learning how to develop your musical ideas, because it will certainly help you with not only making better melodies, but just better music in general. So have a good one and make some good melodies.